Welcome to Jackie's Craft Table. Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. In this video, I'm designing some cards using Simon Says Stamps' limited edition card kit. It's called Valentines for 2019. It included a lot of fun products. It is sold out, but you can buy these products separately. First up are these darling ephemera shapes from Pebbles. I used a lot of these on my cards and I had a lot left over. This little stamp set is called Love Notes. It has a lot of wonderful sentiments in it for Valentine's Day. This is some crafting glue. I like to try out new glues, so I was excited for this. It included 3 gumdrop hearts from Tim Holtz. And this is a stack of 2.5 by 3.5 inch note cards. I love these darling little envelopes. They have it in Desert Storm and Solar White. Next up are 2 wafer dies, and I was really excited for these. These are just so adorable. There's a little sloth, look how cute he is, and a little hedgehog. There's a lot of cute detail to these little dies. This is a drawstring goodie bag. And then a piece of red glitter cardstock. This is so beautiful, and it doesn't rub off on your fingers, so I love that. This pattern paper is also from Pebbles, and it's called Loves Me. It has a lot of cute cut-aparts, and I really loved that it was single-sided. It's hard for me to cut into paper when it's double-sided, so this was just perfect for me, and all of the patterns are just adorable. They match well with the cardstocks that came in the kit, as well as the stamps. A lot of them are foiled, as you can see. I love that flowered one with the foiled flowers. And then the foiled polka dots. This kit came with a lot of paper, so I actually had a lot left over when I was done with my 10 cards. And this set is great too because you can use these stamps and papers for wedding cards or engagement cards. This is a little treat bag. And then onto the stamp set. I love all of the cute critters in this. It's called The Sweetest. And lastly, the cardstock. This is Cotton Candy and Audrey Blue. I believe this is Nina Solar White and Red Velvet and Smoke. When I first get these kits in the mail and look at all of the contents, sometimes I can feel very overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. So what I like to do is just start off with something very simple. I'm starting off using some of the ephemera pieces and some of the pretty cardstock. I'm not worrying about making a card that doesn't turn out or wasting the supplies because it's all fun. I'm just enjoying the process and getting the creative juices flowing. So I'm starting out very simply. I'm using my paper trimmer to cut apart these little rectangles. I'm going to use one of these for the sentiment on this first card. And I also picked out a lot of the pretty flowers from the ephemera pieces. I also cut the smoke cardstock in half to make a card base for this card. This is the little sentiment I'm going to use here. It says, "I'd pick you." And I'm going to mat that with a piece of black cardstock so it doesn't get lost on my pattern paper. And I'm going to pop it up with a little bit of craft foam. I'm using some double-sided adhesive, and I have a hard time peeling the release paper off, so this is where your craft pick really can come in handy. And then I'm just going to put that right in the center of my card. On the inside of my card, I'm going to also use the sentiment that says Happy Valentine's Day. I'm using some Distress Oxide ink to stamp this up. I think it looks so cute on the gray cardstock. I'm using some dry adhesive to attach the pattern paper to my card base. That can be kind of tricky. Using liquid glue to do this is easier. And now I'm just going to arrange everything on the front of my card. It was hard to decide which flowers to use. They're all so pretty. And I also picked out a butterfly to use to put on one of these flowers. I'm just gluing these flowers down flat. I really liked the tacky glue that came in this kit. At first I was worried because it was so cold here. I was worried that it wouldn't work right. So I opened up the top of the bottle just to see what it looked like inside. And it was the consistency of that marshmallow fluff that you can buy in jars at your grocery store. And I thought something was wrong with it. It ended up working out just fine. That just must be its natural consistency. And then I'm adding some confetti across this panel just to bring it up a notch. And then here's the little butterfly, and I carefully bent its wings up so it would have some dimension. And that completes my first card. And I used another ephemera piece on the inside as well as a scrap of the pattern paper. Card number 2 has to be one of my favorites of these 10 cards I created. I cut out a piece of black cardstock with a wonky stitch die. I'm going to make it into a chalkboard card. So I'm using some white pigment ink around the edges of this. And I'm just using a finger dauber. I'm going to set that aside to dry, and I'm using one of the hearts to stamp out a sentiment. This sentiment says, "Be mine." I love all of the little sentiments that came in this Love Notes set. I'm using a lot of the heart ephemera for this card. I'm going to glue on the smaller heart that says love on top of the polka dot heart. And that's going to be my centerpiece. Then I'm gluing on 2 more next to it. On this middle heart, I'm actually going to use some foam squares to add some dimension. But I'm going to glue the smaller hearts down flat onto my black card panel. I also pulled out some ribbon from my stash. I'm going to tie a little bow right under my center heart. And I'm just using some double-sided tape to keep this in place on the back of my panel. I'm using a piece of the cotton candy cardstock for my card base. And now I can go ahead and add my middle heart. I'm waiting to tie the bow until I get that in place. Yeah, that looks so cute. And now I can tie the bow kind of at the side of this little heart. It's pretty easy to do once everything is glued in place. But I am going to use a glue dot behind this. I just don't want anything shifting in the mail. So I'm using a penknife just to scrape off one of the glue dots. And I can just easily tuck this behind the knot and press that in place. I'm also going to add a few clear confetti sequins on this panel. And that completes card number 2. I used another ephemera heart on the inside. This one was just too pretty not to use. And I stamped the sentiments that says, "I adore you." For my next card, I stamped my little hedgehog onto a piece of the Desert Storm cardstock, the 2.5 by 3.5 that came in the kit. And I'm going to color her in with some polychromos pencils. I really loved this hedgehog image in particular because she's holding a little card or a note. I'm coloring in the little heart on this envelope and her bow using the same reds. And then to color the envelope white, I'm actually using a Prismacolor white colored pencil. It just goes on darker than the polychromos one. It does kind of obscure the lines, and I get around that by restamping this image. So I kept the image on the door of my Mini Misty, and now I can just pop that back in and ink up the stamp, and then stamp that down. It just makes the image look really crisp again. I'm using a white gel pen just to brighten up some of the needles on my little hedgehog. I stamped out 2 of the hearts and a sentiment from the Love Notes stamp set. I also stamped out 1 of the butterflies. And I'm using some square dies to cut these out. I want them to look like stamps. And then I just color in this little butterfly with more polychromos pencils. For my main image, I'm going to matte that with another piece of black cardstock. Just ignore that pink card base up at the top. I ended up not using that. And now to assemble my card, I'm using another piece of smoke cardstock for my card base. And this is just going to look like several cards in one. This card was actually all centered around this ephemera piece right here that I'm adhering down. I just loved the look of that. So this is kind of a card with lots of little cards attached to it. After playing with some of the products from this kit, I really come to know what I want in my craft room, and this smoke gray cardstock is something that I need to get. I really love the color of it. I stamped out this darling little raccoon onto a piece of the Nina Solar white cardstock, and I'm going to color him in with some Copic markers. I'm using some warm grays this time to color him in. I usually prefer the cool grays, but I wanted to give my warm grays some attention. He was really fun and quick to color in. I had to reference a real raccoon, so I looked up raccoons on Google and saw lots of cute pictures to use. Now his belly, I didn't want to do gray, so I'm using some yellows, but I didn't like that. So I covered it up with another gray layer. It turns out okay, I think. And then I'm going to fussy cut out this little guy. I used a heart die from my stash to cut out this little heart. And I'm propping up my raccoon with some more foam tape. I'm just going to put him on the side. This is just going to be a fun little note I can put in a lunchbox for one of my kids. The sentiment says, "You stole my heart." And I'm adding a little bit of Wink Estella over the heart and the bow tie on this raccoon. I used my white gel pen again to add highlights to these hearts, and it just fits perfectly in these darling little envelopes. These are just the perfect little Valentines that you could put in your kid's lunchbox or backpack. I'm going to make 2 more little Valentines, and I'm going to use some Stick-It adhesive on some white cardstock, because I'm going to use the 2 dies, the wafer dies that came in this set, the sloth and the little hedgehog. This just turns the pieces of the wafer dies into stickers, so it's easier to attach these die cuts to your cardstocks. I'm going to tape these dies in place and then run it through my Sizzix Big Shot machine, and I could save the rest of this paper for another project. I'm carefully peeling up the purple tape, and then I can use my craft pick to poke out all the little pieces from these dies. It even cuts out that teeny tiny eye on the hedgehog. And there's all my pieces. They look so cute. Now for some fun ink blending. I'm going to use the same Distress Oxides on a piece of Nina Solar White and a piece of the Desert Storm cardstock. So you'll get to see how these same Distress Oxides turn out on 2 different kinds of cardstock. I was using Tattered Rose, but it was just too pale of a color to blend well with my other 2 colors. So I pull in Picked Raspberry for my last color. I'm using Fired Brick and Candied Apple, and then Picked Raspberry, and I'm just trying to get a good blend between these 3 colors. While those dry, I'm using some Copic markers to color in my die cuts. I'm just doing some very simple coloring. And again, this is Nina Solar White cardstock I'm coloring on. For his needles, I'm going to use a light brown Copic marker for a base color, and then a darker brown just to come in and put some texture. For the sloth, I'm also using some more browns, and a darker brown on his hair, and then I do come in and put some texture on that as well. Very fun and fast coloring on this die cut. Now that my Distress Oxide ink is dry on these cardstocks, I'm going to stamp out my sentiments. I'm going to use my Mini Misty to stamp out my sentiments, and I'm going to emboss them with some white embossing powder. I treated my paper with some anti-static powder, and then I'm going to use some Versamark ink to ink up this sentiment. And I always like to ink it up a few times. Then I can pour on my white embossing powder. So I stamped out both of the sentiments on these card panels, and now I'm just going to melt the embossing powder. I'm being really careful not to warp these card panels. I'm going really slow with the heat tool. And once the embossed sentiments have cooled, which doesn't take long at all, I just use a clean cloth to wipe off the anti-static powder. Now I can adhere my cute die cuts onto these panels. I'm just pulling off the release paper, and I can just put those in place. I want this sloth to be at the bottom of the card panel. It's because I don't have a body for him. I know they do have different dies that you can buy at Simon Says Stamp that you can use on all of their different critters. But I don't have one of those in my stash. I thought it would look better at the bottom of this card panel. Now for his little face. And I'm just going to use a bit of glue to adhere his nose and eyes, just because it would be kind of hard to pull off the release paper on these tiny, tiny die cuts. This is where my little jewel picker tool comes in handy. It really helps to pick up these teeny tiny pieces and glue them in place. And now for my little hedgehog. I really like how the sentiment is slanted across this panel. And the stick-it adhesive is kind of nice because it doesn't adhere until you really press it into the paper. So you can move it around until you position it just exactly how you want it. And then for his little eyepiece, I'm using more glue. I'm going to stamp on the envelopes and it just says Happy Valentine's Day. And that finishes off these little Valentines. For my next card, I'm using a piece of the Audrey Blue cardstock, and I'm going to stamp out a lot of the sentiments from these stamp sets across this panel. I'm using an acrylic block and some VersaFine Onyx black ink for this. It's really fun creating your own pattern paper. Not that I needed it, this kit came with so much. This is one of my favorite techniques to do. I'm stamping everything with this black ink, even some little hearts. You can definitely do this with colored inks, but I just wanted everything to be in black for this panel. I'm going to cut off some of the flowers from this ephemera piece. I just wanted these smaller flowers, and I want to attach them to this cute little typewriter. So I'm cutting that down to fit behind this piece of type paper. Then I can just glue that in place. I'm going to use the cotton candy cardstock for my card base for this card. And I did stamp some little gray hearts on it, but they're all going to be covered up. I decided I didn't like the way that looked. I'm putting the Audrey blue panel on top of that. And I'm just gluing this down flat. I put some foam squares behind my little typewriter, and I'm just using my craft pick again to pull off the release paper. My nails are so short, it just comes in handy. And that's going to be centered on this panel. And then I'm going to use some Wink Stella on the heart. This card was pretty quick and easy to put together, but I just had to use this cute little typewriter. And then I used one of the cut-apart sentiments and a flower for the inside of my card, as well as some little strips of the Audrey blue. And now it's time to stamp out this darling little sloth. I'm using a piece of Stonehenge colored pencil paper to color him in. I really love this paper. It's smooth, but it's textured enough to grab the pigment off of your pencils. And I'm using some more of the VersaFine Onyx Black ink to ink him up. So I'm starting out with a gray colored pencil, and then I'm going to move in with a brown. I do a lot of layers on this sloth. This paper is great too because it accepts a lot of layers. You could always use some odorless mineral spirits to blend out your coloring, but I liked the sketchy look of this, so I just left him plain. And I'm going to color in the little leaves, the heart leaves, red and pink. And I'm coloring in the branch different colors of brown so he doesn't blend in with the sloth too much. And then I needed to extend the branch, so I'm just drawing it out with a pencil. And then I can come back in with a Copic multiliner and draw over that. I used a piece of the red velvet paper and I die cut a heart out of that. And this will be a little window for my sloth. And then I'm just extending my coloring as well. And then I decided to come in with a light blue pencil to color in a little bit of background behind him so it isn't so stark white. And then I am re-inking him to make the lines look crisp again. I'm using the sentiment that goes with a sloth. It says, "Hung up on you." And I'm going to stamp that out onto a piece of black cardstock and heat emboss it with white embossing powder. Before I ink up the sentiment, I'm using some anti-static powder. Any of the stray white embossing powder will really show up on this black cardstock, so it's important to use that first. I'm using more Versamark ink to stamp this sentiment. Now I can pour on my white embossing powder and melt that with my heat tool. I'm using my paper trimmer to cut this out into a strip, and then a pair of sharp scissors to cut that on a diagonal. And then I'm just going to glue this down flat at the top of my card. And then I can cut off the overhang. On this panel, I used some foam tape to put behind it. This will add a little bit of dimension for this window. And then I'm going to add this to a white card base. And then I'm using a black gel pen to add a little more definition to his eyes and nose. Just makes them stand out a little more. I also come in later with a white gel pen for the centers of his eyes. I used the leftover heart die cut for the middle of my card. On my next card, I felt like pulling out my little tin of watercolors. I'm stamping out the image of the foxes onto a piece of Arches cold press watercolor paper, And I used a wet paper towel just to dab off a little bit of the ink on their paws and tails, because I want it to look like they're sitting in some grass. I'm going to start off by putting down a base color of green around my foxes. And then I'm going to be doing a lot of layers on this card. While it's still kind of wet, I come in with some red and just kind of let that feather out onto the wet paper. And then I let that dry so I could color in my two foxes. This card took a little bit of time. I let things air dry for the most part. I'm using lots of different colors of green to put in these strands of grass. The purple tape I put around this piece really helps it to dry flat. I put so much water and paint on this that it really did help out. Now I'm coming in with some shadows on my foxes. And I'm just kind of brightening up the flowers as well. And here I do get a bit impatient and I use my heat tool just to finish off the drying of this card. And I want it to be perfectly dry because I'm going to come in with some colored pencils now. I love using watercolors and pencils together. And then I'm just putting down another layer of grass. I'm making sure to bring the grass up over the foxes so it looks like they're sitting there on the grass. And then I come in with more pencils to give them more shading as well. I pull out my white gel pen to add little highlights on the grass. And I think this adds a lot to it. When I use my gel pens over watercolor, I have to remember to draw really slowly and not press down too hard or the ink just won't flow. And then I'm putting this on a piece of the red velvet cardstock and adding a little bit of Wink Stella to his bow and the heart. And then I'm stamping the sentiment right onto this panel, and it says, "Hey Foxy." It's a bold enough sentiment that it won't be obscured by the scene, and that completes this card. I stamped out another sentiment on the inside and a heart. This one was really fun to put together. We're on to the last card now, and I'm going to create a fold-out card that will fit in one of the mini envelopes that came in this kit. I'm using a piece of Desert Storm cardstock that I cut down to 7 by 3.5. I scored it at 2.5 and again at 5. And I'm not going to fold it completely because I want to be able to stamp on this still. For the front panel of this fold-out card, I'm using some candied apple Distress Oxide, and I blended that into an ombre, so it's going to be darkest at the bottom and then fade lighter to the top. I'm going to use the cute little hedgehog images from the stamp set. I'm stamping the little girl with the envelope on the middle panel and the little boy hedgehog with the flowers on the last panel. And I'm going to stamp out several sentiments on this card. And I'm using some more candied apple Distress Oxide ink for this. I'm going to pull out my colored pencils again to color in these images. I really like coloring on Craft or Desert Storm cardstock because the images really pop off of this Desert Storm paper. And I want the Distress Oxide on the front panel to dry completely before I stamp my main sentiment there. And I'm going to heat emboss that with some white embossing powder. So I want it to be perfectly dry or the embossing powder will stick all over it. I colored the hedgehog's little bouquet of flowers blue because I want it to kind of fit the poem that I'm going to stamp on the front of this card, which says, "Roses are red, violets are blue. You are my Valentine and I love you." So I had to include something blue on this card. I treated my paper with some more anti-static powder, and I'm going to stamp up the sentiment along with these cute little stacked hearts. And then I can pour over my white embossing powder. I'm being very careful again to not warp the paper. I'm just putting it over the sentiment for a second, and then I'm bringing the heat tool off again. And now that everything is dry, I'm using my bone folder to press everything down. I wanted to quickly show you my logo stamp. I've had a few questions about this. I had this stamp made up with my Jackie's Craft Table logo on it so that I could stamp it on the backs of all of my cards that I create. I think it's just a nice and fun finishing touch. Now that that is stamped, I'm going to use my bone folder to crease down my last fold. And I pulled out my corner chomper, and I'm just going to round out the bottom edges of this little card. And I just wanted to show you how cute it looks in this little white envelope. And there it is all unfolded. This was a really fun card to do, and I hope you'll give this a try with whatever stamps you may have in your stash. As always, my friends, thanks so much for watching and for thumbs upping and all of your lovely comments. I really appreciate them. A very happy Valentine's Day to all of you. Bye.